Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We move to the next chapter in the Kitab Nikah about the recommendation of being married during the month of Shawwal and taking the bride in the house during this month. This is the statement of Aisha radiallahu anha, who says that the Messenger of Allah والسلام, married me in Shawwal, and he consummated marriage with me in Shawwal. And who amongst the wives of the Prophet was dearer to the Prophet than I? And Aisha would like that the women of her family should enter the houses of the husbands as brides during the month of Shawwal. Shawwal is one of the sacred months, and it comes right after Ramadan, so it is the 10th month. Why did Aisha make such a statement? Well, the reason is because in the days of Jahiliyyah, they would think that Shawwal is a bad luck month. They would say that if a woman got married during this month, the marriage would not work out, and there would be disputes between her and the husband. So Aisha here is pointing out that this belief is batil, it is null and void. There is no bad luck month. But we ask the question, is it recommended to get married in Shawwal? Well, the asl here is no, it is not recommended to get married in any particular month. However, we could argue that it is recommended to get married in Shawwal if you're doing it for the reason to show others that it is permissible to get married in Shawwal and that there is nothing bad luck about Shawwal. If this is the intention, because perhaps you're living in a place in which people think that it is bad luck to get married in Shawwal. So if it's your intention to remove this batil aqidah, then yes, this is a praiseworthy act and a praiseworthy intention. Otherwise, you should not think from this narration that there is any virtue in being married in Shawwal, nor in any other month for that matter. It may be argued that if a person is young and he is getting married, he will have strong desire. Now if he gets married in Sha'ban, the month before Ramadan, then it may be that his strong desire overcomes him because he's just newly married, which would then lead him to spoil some of his fasts during Ramadan, as he has conjugal relations when he ought not to be doing so. But this is an ijtihadi matter, and common sense needs to be applied here. One needs to think, if one is young, of strong desire, then perhaps it will be better for him not to get married in Sha'ban nor Ramadan, but to get married afterwards. And we do not say this as a hukum shar'i, but just as a common sense matter. Aisha asks the question, who was dearer than I? Now somebody might reply, well, Khadija. And this would be interesting. It is difficult to decide who was dearer to the Prophet. Was it Aisha or Khadija? Because they did not come together in one and the same marriage contract. But what we can say is that each of them has a particular virtue that the other one doesn't. So as for Khadija radiallahu anha, then her great virtue is that she was the mother of the children of the Prophet, but also she was the first person to embrace Islam and to comfort the Prophet during these first few days, which were the hardest for the Prophet to accept the fact that he is a prophet. No one was there for him except Khadija in these early days to protect him and to give him comfort and psychological support. We also know the Prophet did not marry anyone whilst he was married to Khadija. And we also know that even after her death, the Prophet would make much mention of her. He would even become joyous upon seeing the sister of Khadija, whose name was Hala, because she would remind him of Khadija. He would send gifts like meat to her friends. So look how he would even honor her friends. What about Aisha radiallahu anha? Well, her great virtue is her knowledge. She transmitted so much from the Prophet ﷺ. She's one of the top transmitters of a hadith from the Prophet. She was definitely the most beloved to the Prophet from her co-wives. During the day of his death, he wanted to be with Aisha. He asked, Aina ana al-yawm? Where am I meant to be today? Aina ana ghadan? Where am I meant to be tomorrow? He wanted Aisha to nurse him during his last days. And we know that he died on her lap, and in that there is a great virtue for Aisha as well. As for this matter of bad luck, then seeing an evil omen, it's called tatayyur in Arabic, comes from tayr, which is a bird. And this is because the Arabs would see an evil omen with birds. You would set a bird free, then depending on which way it would fly, you would see a good omen or an evil omen. So an evil omen is simply when you perceive bad luck or a bad sign, either by seeing something or by hearing something or by something which is known. So as for when you see something, then let us suppose you go out of the home wanting to do a particular job, or let's say you have a particular errand to run, and you see a sick person, and you take that as a bad omen, that something bad is going to happen if you continue on walking and complete your job or the errand that you have to run. And so upon that you turn back to your home and do not complete the work you set out to do. Why? Because you saw a sick person, and a sick person indicates that your work will not be fruitful or that some calamity will befall you. So this is a tatayyur with something which is seen, a mar'i, something which is seen. As for tatayyur from something which is heard, then let us suppose you go out to run your business and you overhear somebody saying, there has been a bad loss today, and you take that to be an evil omen that your business will suffer a bad loss, and so you stop walking on and do not open your business for the day. So that is perceiving a bad omen with something which is heard, or you can perceive an evil omen from something which is known. So for example, a particular time period, and that would be how the Arab would say that it is bad luck to get married in Shawwal. Now Shawwal is a month. It is not something that can be seen or heard as an item, but it is something ma'loom, known. It is upon the Muslim not to be thrown off by these barriers and obstacles which are purely psychological. Rather, the Muslim is one who has firm will. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. When you have made your firm will, then make reliance upon Allah. And this is the Muslim. He has azima, a firm will, and he has tawakkul upon Allah Jalla wa Ala at the same time. And we also know the Prophet ﷺ gave us a better way, Salat al-Istikhara, if you're unsure about something. Of course, that something needs to be a permissible matter. It mustn't be a matter which is outright haram, or something which is outright wajib. There is no istikhara for those matters, but rather, if it is something which is just permissible, such as getting married to a particular person or opening up a particular business and the like, then yes, make Salat al-Istikhara, this is the better way. Let us move to the next chapter about looking at the woman you are proposing to, looking at her hands and the face. From Abu Hurairah, he says, I was with the Prophet, and a man came informing the Prophet that he married a woman from the Ansar. The Prophet asked him, أَنَظَرْتَ إِلَيْهَا, did you look at her? قَالَ لَا, he said no. The Prophet said, فَاذْهَبْ فَانظُرْ إِلَيْهَا فَإِنَّ فِي أَعْيُنِ الْأَنصَارِ شَيْئًا. Go and take a look at her, because in the eyes of the Ansar there is something. That is to say, there was some defect in the eyes of the women of the Ansar. What is the ruling for a man to look at a woman whom he is marrying or proposing to? Well, some scholars said it is mubah, permissible, because the order to look at this woman comes after the prohibition of looking at women, because we know the order is to lower your gaze. And so an order after prohibition means permissibility, as in, for example, وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا, and when you become halal from the ihram, then hunt, because we know you're not allowed to hunt during the ihram, but then the order is given to hunt. It does not mean it is wajib, rather it means it's permissible. Other scholars said, no, it is recommended, and this is the weightier opinion. This is the sunnah, this is what the Prophet ordered. As for saying that it is permissible, then no. If an order comes after a prohibition, then the ruling returns to what it was before the prohibition. So as for the hunting, before the prohibition it was permissible, and then the order to hunt after the prohibition means the ruling returns to what it was before the prohibition. That is to say, it is permissible. So simply put, before and after the ihram, hunting is permissible. As for this case of looking at the women, then yes, the woman you are proposing to, it is recommended for you to look at her. We have many other evidences as well. In the Sunan, such as Tirmidhi and others, the Prophet said about looking at the woman you're proposing to, فَإِنَّهُ أَحْرَى أَن يُؤْدَمَ بَيْنَكُمَا. It is more likely that looking at her will bring you closer together and unite you, so that if you like each other, for example, physically, and there is chemistry between you, then yes, it will bring you closer together. He also said, إِذَا خَطَبَ أَحَدُكُمْ الْمَرْأَةَ فَإِنِ اسْتَطَعْتَ أَنْ يَنْظُرَ مِنْهَا مَا يَدْعُوهُ إِلَى نِكَاحِهَا فَلْيَفْعَلْ. When one of you proposes to a woman, then if he is able to look at her, at that which will encourage him to marry her, then let him do so. We could argue that the Prophet forbade visiting graves, but then afterwards he ordered people to visit the grave. Does that mean it is just permissible to visit the graves? Well, we can argue it is recommended to visit graves because it will remind you of your destination. The Prophet told him that there is some defect in the eyes of the Ansar. He is warning him that perhaps his woman may be one of those afflicted. If that's the case, he may be put off by her, so make sure you get that issue sorted out with straight away. Now, the Prophet was not speaking about any one particular person, hence he was not backbiting against anyone. However, if you do speak about any one particular person, would that be permissible? Well, if it is for the case of nasiha, in which there is a need to do so, then yes, it is permissible to speak about someone else, even if he is a Muslim, about that which he would not want to hear about himself. The evidence in the Sahih we have where 3 men proposed marriage to Fatima bint Qais. One of them was a man called Abu Jahm, and the Prophet said about him that he does not take his stick off his back, meaning to say he hits his wives, so do not marry him, because wife beating is haram. It is an abuse. Note, we say wife beating is haram, but wife disciplining is not haram, just like children beating is haram, but children disciplining is not haram. But anyway, that was his advice for her. Now, Abu Jahm would not like to hear this being said about him, but it is not ghiba. It would be nasiha. Also, Muawiyah was another one to propose to her, and he said about Muawiyah, أما معاوية فصعلوك لا مال له. Muawiyah is poor, he has no wealth. Again, Muawiyah would not like that to be said about him. And the third one to propose to her was Usama ibn Zayd, and he said about him, Inkihi Usama, marry Usama instead. Okay, the next question is, what can you look at? Well, the ulama say that you can look at the face, the hands, and the feet. You can also look at the head and the neck, because looking at all of this will encourage you to marry her. However, there must be conditions. Firstly, the man must be serious about getting married. He must have a firm intention of getting married. So he's not just taking a look casually. No casual attitude allowed. Secondly, it must be the case that he is likely to be accepted by the family of the bride. So if he is somebody not of the same class as the bride, then he's likely to be rejected. In that case, no, it is not permissible to look at her. Thirdly, and obviously, there must be no privacy between them. So if he is going to look at her, there must be somebody else present, an adult, in the room. Obviously, as you know, privacy will lead to much fitna, and shaitan will be the third. In another narration of this chapter, the Prophet asked him about the mahr, and he said that the mahr was 4 uqiyah. 1 uqiyah is 40 dirham, so 4 awaq would be 160 dirham. Now the Prophet disapproved of this amount because it was too much. The Prophet said, as if you have dug up some silver by the side of this mountain, such that you can give her that much. And this is understandable, because imagine if people now start competing with each other as to who can give the highest amount of mahr. The matter will soon spiral out of control. Let us now move on to the next chapter about the mahr. The narration is long, let us translate it. From Sahl ibn Sa'd as-Sa'idi, he says, a woman came to the Prophet, giving herself to the Prophet in marriage. The Prophet looked at her from head to toe, and then he lowered his head. When she saw that he had not made a decision, she sat down. A man of the companions said, O Messenger of Allah, marry her to me if you do not want her. The Prophet asked, do you have anything to give as the mahr? And the man said, no, I do not have anything. The Prophet said, go back and see if you can find something. And so he did so and returned and said that I have found nothing. The Prophet told him again, go and find something, even if it is an iron ring. So he went, tried to look for something, and returned empty-handed. He said, I found nothing, not even an iron ring. He said, but I have my izar with me, which is the lower garment. So he did not even have an upper garment. He says, I will give half of it to her. The Prophet said, what good would that do? If you wear it, she will not have any of it, and if she wears it, you will not have any of it. So then the man sat down and remained seated there. And after a while, he got up to leave. As he was doing so, the Prophet called him back and asked him, "How much of the Quran do you know?" And the man told the Prophet how much he knew. The Prophet asked him, "Can you recite them by heart?" The man said yes. And then the Prophet replied to him, "Idhab faqad mulliktaha bima ma'aka min al-Quran." Go, for I have given you possession of her, meaning married you to her, for what you have of the Quran. In another wording he said, "Intaliq faqad zawajtukaha fa'allimha min al-Quran." Go, for I have married you to her, teach her from the Quran. We can take some benefits from this hadith. We take that it is permissible for a woman to give herself in marriage to the Prophet, and this is one of those specific aspects of the Prophet. The Quran mentions this, إِن وَهَبَتْ نَفْسَهَا لِلنَّبِيِّ, that she is halal for the Prophet to marry if she gives herself to the Prophet in marriage. إِن أَرَادَ النَّبِيُّ أَن يَسْتَنْكِحَهَا, if the Prophet wants to marry her, خَالِصَةً لَكَ مِن دُونِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, purely for you and not for the other mu'mineen. For the other mu'mineen, you have to have the wali who gives his daughter in marriage to this man, with a mahar, of course, and the man has to give the mahar. We take the permissibility of looking at the woman you are proposing to marriage. The Prophet took a look at her from head to toe, but he did not desire her, so he just kept quiet. We find the virtue of this particular woman, who is unnamed in the narration, that she did not marry the Prophet for worldly gains. Of course, the Prophet did not have much worldly riches. Her intention was to become al-Mu'mineen, the mother of the believers, and this is a high status, naturally. And the wives of the Prophet have this special virtue. We also take the good manners the Sahaba had with the Prophet. Here this Sahabi says, "O Prophet, if you do not have any need for her, then marry me to her." He did not straight away ask, "Marry me to her." Another example of good manners is Dhul Yadayn, the man with two long arms. He said to the Prophet, "Anasita am qusirat as-salah?" Did you forget, or has the prayer been shortened? This is when the Prophet prayed 2 rak'at in a 4 rak'at prayer. Notice he missed out the third option, which is that the Prophet deliberately shortened it, because that is not possible. We take an interesting fa'idah from this hadith. The Prophet conducted this marriage. Now we might ask, but this woman may have had a wali, she may have had a father, who would have most right to be a wali, would he not? But we find that the Prophet has more rights than even the wali of a woman. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, "An-Nabiyyu awla bil-mu'minina min anfusihim." The Prophet has more rights to the believers than they have on themselves. And this is a specific aspect of the Prophet, because the Prophet has more rights over the mu'mineen than anyone else. Even the woman's own father. The Prophet can stand as a wali of the woman, even if she has a father, because the Prophet has most rights. This is specific to him. We also take that a nikah contract can only be correct with a mahar, because the Prophet insisted that this man give the mahar, despite the fact that he was so poor. He only had an izar on him, no other possession. We also find the importance of confirming and checking. The man here tells the Prophet that he has nothing, but the Prophet still tells him to go to your family members and see if you can find something. The Prophet does not just take his word for it. He insists that he goes and checks and makes sure. And this should be a general philosophy for every Muslim, is to check and make sure of every detail before arriving at a judgment. A vital benefit here. This doesn't just apply to the mahar in this scenario, it applies in all scenarios. We also take from this hadith the permissibility of taking an oath when you're not asked to take an oath. And this is in order to put the mind of the other person at ease and at rest. We take this because the man said, "La wallahi ya Rasulallah, wala khatamun min hadid." No, wallahi, O Messenger of Allah, I do not even have an iron ring. A question comes up here. The Prophet mentions or suggests an iron ring, but can we be sure that the woman would accept this iron ring as a mahar? After all, she's the one getting married, not the Prophet. But this is a valid question, and we can answer here by saying that we can be quite sure that the woman would be happy with what the Prophet would be happy with. But of course, this cannot be done nowadays. We are not of the same status as the Prophet, so what needs to be done nowadays is that the woman's contentment ought to be sought, and one must not rip off this woman by giving her less than what she deserves. There is a narration in the Sunan of Abu Dawood and At-Tirmidhi which is weak, and it says that the iron ring is the adornment of the people of the fire. The hadith is weak in its isnad, but also this hadith now rejects that weak hadith, whereas this particular hadith is in the Sahihain. If an iron ring was haram to be worn, then of course the Prophet would not allow it as a mahar. We also take that this man only had an izar. These Sahaba, many of them were poor people. Just imagine wearing one izar, which is the lower garment. But the Sahaba had tawakkul on Allah Jalla wa Ala. So He would provide for them like He provides for the birds who set out in the morning hungry and they return with full bellies. The Prophet pointed out here that half an izar, which is what the man's suggestion was, is simply no good. You cannot have half an izar, it will not cover you properly. You have to have a whole izar. Somebody might say, but why doesn't he give her this izar as a mahar? Then afterwards, the woman can give this izar back to him as a gift, as a hiba. And the answer to this is quite straightforward. This is simply a hila muharrama, a haram tactic to get around an obligation. And such hiyal are not permissible. We can also take from this hadith that you do not take out a loan if you want to give someone a mahar. The Prophet did not ask him to do this, even though it would have been possible. Taking out a loan humiliates you, because the person you owe the money, ipso facto, you are lowering and humiliating yourself to that person, to your creditor. And you do not want to be in that type of position. You want to remain upright and aziz, honored, not dhalil or lowered. And whoever is unable to get married because he does not have money and the like, then he should fast. This is what the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to do, and this was one of the earliest hadith which we took in the Kitab al-Nikah. And Allah Jalla wa Ala also says, وَلْيَسْتَعْفِفِ الَّذِينَ لَا يَجِدُونَ نِكَاحًا حَتَّى يُغْنِيَهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. And let those who do not find a means of marriage refrain and keep themselves patient by not committing zina and being patient on that until Allah enriches them from His grace. We also take from this hadith the concern the Prophet had for his companions. He really wanted this man to get married. We take from this hadith that the Quran can be given as a mahar. That is to say, teaching the Quran to someone else can be a mahar. The mahar was that he's going to teach her the Quran. There is another version of this hadith in which there are some words added. It is reported that the Prophet said, لَن تُجْزِئَ عَنْ أَحَدٍ بَعْدَكَ مَهْرًا. After you, it will not be acceptable to give this as a mahar to anyone. But this wording, not in Muslim, is da'if. Somebody might ask, but this mahar, teaching the Quran, it's majhul, it is unknown, because we do not know how long it will take for her to learn this Quran from the man. So it is majhul, it is unknown. Well, the answer is, this is not a sales contract where the item needs to be known. Hence, some jahala is permissible, and there's no problem with that. The mahar is just something that makes it permissible for the man to have conjugal relations with the wife. And even if there is jahala, it is a small amount, it is not too large. We also take from the hadith that the nikah contract can be conducted using any words which carry the meaning of marrying someone off. Because this hadith has different wordings to it. مَلَّكْتُكَهَا مُلِّكْتَهَا زَوَّجْتُكَهَا. The matter is broad. So if a man says, I give you my daughter for such and such an amount of mahar, then this is absolutely fine, because it carries the same meaning as marriage. We can also take that the husband does not need to necessarily say, قَبِلْتُ, I accept, when the wali says that I give you my daughter in marriage. As long as it is known that the husband definitely accepts, this is what really matters. In the hadith, in our context, we know that the man is the one who definitely wants to accept this marriage contract. We find here the Prophet took a look at this woman. Does that mean her face was uncovered? Well, we know that the women of the Sahaba would cover their faces. We know that from many evidences, that this was the norm. Whether it is wajib to cover your face or not, that's another debate. But the point is, they used to cover their faces. If this woman in this hadith is not covering the face, then there's no problem, because the hijab was only made wajib in the 6th year from the hijrah, and that's quite late on. So it is likely that this would have been before the hijab being made obligatory.
In any case, the hijab was more strict on the wives of the Prophet. They would cover their faces. This narration could be used as an evidence to say that the other women did not have to cover their faces. In any case, it is better to cover the face. It is more concealing and further away from fitna.
We can also take a vital lesson from this hadith. It is that you're allowed to take payment for teaching the Quran, and indeed the whole of this deen of Islam, by way of analogy. Because here the man is teaching the Quran and he's actually taking something in return, which is that he's able to now have conjugal relations with the wife. However, it is not permissible simply to recite the Quran for others to listen to and that they should pay you. Because a recitation of the Quran is a pure act of worship. But teaching the Quran is a service you are performing for someone else to benefit them. It is not a pure act of worship in and of itself. Certainly it is reward worthy and you could call it an act of ibadah, but it is also a service. Whereas the recitation of the Quran is a pure act of ibadah. It is not a service. We have another narration in the same chapter from Abu Salama ibn Abdurrahman. He says he asked Aisha radiallahu anha about the sadaq or the mahar of the Prophet to his wives, and she said that his sadaq to his wives was 12 uqiyah and a half. So this turns out to be 500 dirham. This was the sadaq of the Prophet to his wives. Now we know that this was not the mahar to all of the wives, but this would have been the normal mahar. There were exceptions. We can take from this narration the eagerness of the early Muslims to learn about this deen, because here is Abu Salama ibn Abdurrahman asking about the mahar of the Prophet. He's eager to learn, and you learn not just for the sake of knowledge but rather to act upon it. If you remember from the previous narration that we mentioned this man married for 4 awaq, and the Prophet expressed disapproval that this is too much. The narration we're referring to is when the man said, I have married one of the women of the Ansar, and the Prophet told him to go back and look at her because there is something defective in the eyes of the Ansar. That narration, in a version of that narration, he asked, what was the mahar? He said 4 awaq, and the Prophet said, it's as if you have been digging up the side of this mountain, extracting silver, such that you can give her that much. Yet we find in this narration 12 and a half uqiyah are given. And the reason for this is that there's a great difference. The Prophet could afford it, whereas that man was poor, he could not afford it. So therefore, giving away that much mahar would damage him financially, and of course that's not sensible. Let's take this third narration. From Anas ibn Malik, he says that the Prophet saw Abdurrahman bin Auf with some yellow color on him, and the Prophet asked him, "Ma hadha, what is this?" He said, "Ya Rasulullah, inni tazawwajtu imra'atan ala wazni nawatin min dhahab." O Messenger of Allah, I have married a woman, giving her a date stone worth of gold as the mahar. The Prophet said, "Barakallahu lak, awlim walau bishah." May Allah bless you. Give a walima even if it is with one sheep. So we take from this hadith that you are allowed to give gold as mahar. You can give anything of value as the mahar, even a couple of sandals, even an iron ring, as we just saw. Basically anything which you can sell or any service which you can charge for can also be given as a sadaqah. We take from this narration that it is legislated to tell the married couple Barakallahu lak or Barakallahu lakuma, basically making dua for blessing, because marriage is a critical time and you have to ask for blessing, because if a marriage is deprived of blessing, it ends up in a divorce, as you can see with the marriages of the kuffar nowadays. We find here that it is legislated to give the walima, the wedding feast. Most scholars say it is recommended and it is not wajib. There is, of course, an order format. So one could say that if one can afford it, it is wajib, but if you cannot afford it, it is not wajib. This would also be an understandable opinion. But if one is poor and he cannot give the walima, but then afterwards Allah enriches him, we will not tell him to give the walima, because the time for that has passed. We take that the walima is upon the husband, not the woman. Attending the walima is wajib. So if the husband gives the walima and he invites you, this is wajib to attend. But if the woman gives the walima, it's not wajib upon her, and she invites you, it is not obligatory upon you to attend. So note this difference. Why? Because this would not be the official walima, because the official walima must be given by the husband. That is, the official walima, meaning the walima which the Prophet has ordered. An interesting discussion comes up from this hadith. He says, وَلَوْ بِشَاء, even if it is with a sheep. What does this mean? Is the Prophet intending here, وَلَوْ بِشَاء, even with a sheep, meaning to say a sheep is a small amount? Or is the Prophet intending here, a sheep is a large amount? So, does the Prophet intend, give a walima even if it is with as little as one sheep? Or does the Prophet intend, you must give the walima even if you have to spend as large as one sheep? Well, this could be understood in both ways. Practically speaking, however, we say that the walima needs to be given in accordance with your means. لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَتِهِ. Let the one who has been given a lot of wealth spend in accordance with his wealth. So it's all relative as to how much you should spend. This is the bottom line. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَتِهِ وَمَنْ قُدِرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقُهُ فَلْيُنْفِقْ مِمَّا آتَاهُ اللَّهُ لَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا مَا آتَاهَا سَيَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ بَعْدَ عُسْرٍ يُسْرًا. Let's move to the next chapter now, about freeing the slave girl and marrying her. It's a long narration. Let's take the translation. Anas reports this. He says the Prophet went out to the expedition of Khaybar, and we prayed the Fajr in the early hours. He says we moved into the streets of Khaybar, riding close to each other, so close that my knee touched the leg of the Prophet. He said the lower garment of the Prophet slipped from him, and I could see the whiteness of his leg. As he entered Khaybar, he said, Allahu Akbar, Khaybar is ruined. When he said, Inna idha nazalna bisahati qawmin fasa'a sabahul munzarin. When we descend into the valley of the people, then evil indeed is the morning of those who are warned. He said this 3 times. The people saw the Prophet and warned each other that Muhammad has come. And it says, we took the territory by force, and there were gathered prisoners of war. Dihya al-Kalabi, one of the companions, said, bestow upon me a girl from the prisoners. The Prophet said to him, take anyone. And he took Safiya bint Huyay ibn Akhtab. And so another man came to the Prophet and he said, O Prophet, you have actually bestowed Safiya bint Huyay, who is the daughter of the chief of Bani Qurayza, and An-Nadir, and a girl of her status only suits you. So the Prophet said, call Dihya back, and he told him to take someone else apart from her. Then the Prophet freed Safiya bint Huyay from servitude, and he married her. One of the narrators, Thabit, says to Abu Hamza, how much mahr did he give her? And he replied, her mahr was her freedom. And on the way, Sulaym adorned Safiya and sent her then to the Prophet. The next morning he held a walima, and he said to the people, anyone who has anything to eat, let him bring it. And so then a cloth was spread, and a man came with cheese, another came with dates, and another came with cooked butter. And from that they prepared hais. This is basically a dish which is made from cheese and dates, compounded together. And that was the wedding feast, or the walima of the Prophet. And there the narration ends. And so from this narration we can take some points of benefit. First of all, the land of Khaybar was conquered by force. Banu Nadir were the inhabitants, a Jewish tribe. With Banu Nadir, the Prophet told them that they could stay and work on their plantation, and the Muslims will have half of the crops. This is called Muzara'ah, and it is permissible. We can take that you're allowed to start the battle at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. This is an ijtihadi matter. You do what suits you best. In this particular instance, it was in the morning, because the Prophet said, how bad is the morning of those who have been warned. That is to say, that they're going to be vanquished. Normally, the Prophet would battle at the end of the daytime when the wind would blow, and there would be less heat. In the narration it is mentioned that Anas was riding behind the Prophet. It is permissible for 2 people to ride on one animal as long as it does not cause hardship on the animal and that the animal can bear it. The narration mentions that the thigh of the Prophet became uncovered. Does this mean that the thigh is not an awrah? Or does it mean that the thigh is an awrah, but this was a particular case where the izar may have been a bit short, so it would have uncovered the thigh of the Prophet. So it's not like the Prophet did this intentionally. However, in the salah, there is no difference. The thigh must be covered. But it's just that the difference is outside the salah. Is the thigh an awrah or not? Some scholars say no, it is not awrah, so it can be uncovered, and this hadith proves it, that there is nothing wrong with it. And other scholars say no, it is awrah, and as for this hadith, it was unintentional, and that the izar of the Prophet was short. Definitely the safer option is to cover it, because then no one can argue against you. And also, if a person is young, let's say, and attractive, then uncovering the thigh can cause fitna. So in a case like this, it is even more incumbent upon him to cover the thighs. We find in the narration the Prophet makes takbir. It is legislated to make takbir when you win against your opponents, and also when you move upwards, like you climb up a hill and move upwards or elevate yourself physically. And the reason for that should be clear, because when you move upwards or elevate yourself or move up a hill, let's say, or perhaps you win over your opponents, then you can feel pride in yourself. You may not be able to control it, but you can feel pride and a sense of highness. And at that particular point, you have to remind yourself that Allah Jalla wa Ala is the greatest, not you. So at times of joy, at times when you're feeling high and mighty, it is legislated to say Allahu Akbar. And thus you maintain your humility. Likewise, when you are descending to a lower place, you say Subhanallah. This means to say that Allah is free of any defects or any lowly characteristics. And this is when you're going lower. And in particular, when you're flying an aeroplane, most people travel on an aeroplane. The aeroplane takes off, it goes up. You should make takbir at those times. An aeroplane lands. You should now make tasbih. That is to say Subhanallah. These are from the etiquettes of journeying in an aeroplane. We can also take from this narration to see a good omen. The Prophet said Khaybar has been ruined. What he means by this is not that Khaybar has been destroyed or ruined in that way, but rather ruined for its people, in that they're going to lose Khaybar when the Muslims have victory over Banu Nadir. Of course, at the time when he said it, the battle had not begun, but the Prophet was positive, and he was convinced with 100% certainty that the Muslims are going to win. Not like the cowards following Musa alayhi salam, who said that we will not enter Jerusalem because there are a mighty army in there. Only when they leave we will enter. And they told Musa alayhi salam,
فَاذْهَبْ أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ فَقَاتِلَا
إِنَّا هَاهُنَا قَاعِدُونَ. You and your Rabb go and fight, we are sitting here. The Prophet said in another hadith, وَيُعْجِبُنِي الْفَعْلِ. A goodly word, or a promising word, pleases me. This is something which encourages you
to do,
which you have set about to do. The Prophet obviously has taken his inspiration from the Quran. فَإِذَا نَزَلَ بِسَاحَتِهِمْ فَسَاءَ صَبَاحُ الْمُنذَرِينَ is mentioned in the Quran. We can take that when the people of the Muslimin descend upon the valley of the disbelievers in a fight scenario, then the defeat of the kuffar is imminent. And this is the case if the Muslims are like the Sahaba. As for if the Muslims are like today, chasing after the dunya, then we cannot expect victory anytime soon. Allah Jalla wa Ala teaches us, هُوَ الَّذِي أَرْسَلَ رَسُولَهُ بِالْهُدَى وَدِينِ الْحَقِّ لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. He is the one who has sent his messenger with the guidance and the deen of truth, that it may prevail over all other ideologies or ways of life. But this victory can only come when we actually hold on to this huda, to this guidance and to this deen of truth. We can also take that you can repeat a certain statement to make it more emphatic, because the Prophet said 3 times, Allahu Akbar, kharibat khaybar, inna idha nazalna bisahati qawmin fasa'a sabahul munzarin. We take from this hadith how frightened the Yahud were of the Prophet and his companions. It's complete role reversal nowadays. They are completely on top. That's because the Muslims nowadays are not like the companions. We can take from the hadith that the women and children who do not fight for the kuffar are taken in as servants for the Muslim population. As for the fighters, then Allah Jalla wa Ala says about them, حَتَّى إِذَا أَثْخَنْتُمُوهُمْ فَشُدُّوا الْوَثَاقَ فَإِمَّا مَنًّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فِدَاءً. Until when you have slaughtered many of them, then tie the knot, meaning take them in as prisoners. Then after that you can just release them, or you can release them for a ransom, that is, for money. There is a third option, which is that they can be executed if the leader believes that to be the best option. The other option with the fighters is that they can be taken in as servants, just like the non-fighters, though there is a difference of opinion amongst the scholars on this particular matter. That is this fourth option. And if someone argues saying it is not fair and it is not right, or perhaps it is immoral that you should take women and children as your servants, then the answer is quite clear that Islam is not built upon your framework of morality. Rather, Islam is built upon what Allah Jalla wa Ala commands and what He prohibits, so that there is no morality in the deen of Islam. There are just commands and prohibitions, that's it. We also take a vital lesson that if you deprive someone of what he wants, then give him something in return. This is what happened with Dihya. The Prophet took away Safiya bint Huyay from him, but he gave him someone else in return. We learn the vital lesson from this hadith that setting a servant free, in this case a female servant, can serve as her mahar, because definitely this is something of value. We also take the virtue of Sulaim. She's the one who prepared Safiya bint Huyay to enter the house of the Prophet. We find in this narration Safiya bint Huyay was given to the Prophet by night time, and in the marriage of Aisha she was given to the Prophet by daytime. So either way is permissible. We find in the walima of the Prophet here, the Prophet tells people to bring food to the walima so they can all contribute. Now, there is nothing wrong with doing this as long as it is customarily acceptable. In most places, this may not be acceptable customarily, that people bring their own food to the walima, and in such a case then it should not be done. So one needs to take guidance from the customs in this particular matter. And in the walima there is no problem in having good luxury food. The evidence for this is because they made hais from dates and dried or cooked butter, and this is a good quality food. In another wording of this narration in the chapter, Anas specifically and directly says that the Prophet freed Safiya and he made her freedom as her sadaq or her mahar. It's just that some scholars would say that you cannot give the freeing or the itq as the mahar, because when a woman is a servant, you can certainly free her. But once you freed her, she can easily reject your proposal of marriage unless you give her the mahar. But you will say, I gave you the mahar, it's your freedom. She will say, no, I don't accept that. That was when I was a servant and now I am free. I have full rights and I can demand a mahar from you. And that I do not accept the freedom to be my mahar. She may argue like this. And so some scholars said that if she does argue like this, and she has the right to argue like this, then the itq, the freedom, cannot be the mahar. However, we say that this argument is from your own mind, your own rationale. What is more worthy to be followed are the narrations. And if Anas, the narrator of the hadith, says that the Prophet made the freedom or the itq of Safiya her mahar, then this is what we must follow.
So the narration takes precedence over your rationale. Let's take a few more points of benefit. Abdurrahman ibn Auf had some yellow color. This was from the za'afran. And we know that the weightier ruling is that men are not allowed to put on za'afran, mutlaqan, in the absolute sense. So it appears that this colouring may have got on him from the woman, and it was accidental. And it appears the Prophet is asking him, Ma hadha, what is this? As a question of rebuke, as if to say this should not be on you. Also about the walima, it could be done before the consummation of the marriage or after. There's no evidence to suggest either way. But the point is, it is done after the marriage contract. This is the important point. Also, with regards to freeing your servant woman and marrying her and making the freedom the mahar, it appears that the master does not need the wali of the woman, meaning he does not need the father of the woman to contract this marriage, because the master here is essentially the wali. Now, there is a difference of opinion on this matter, but this appears to be the case from the narration. Okay, let's take some review questions. So, question number 1. When proposing to a woman, which parts of the body can you look at? Question number 2. On what occasions should you utter the takbir? And when should you say the tasbih? Question number 3. Some people say that you cannot make the sadaq as the itq. Explain how the proponents of this opinion argue and what would be the reply to that.